serendipity. All things have worked out beautifully, and I'm in your lovely, lovely company through the power of the internet. But I'm also there with you spiritually. I've been watching since you began this morning and will continue to do so throughout the symposium. I'm so grateful that such an eclectic mix of roundtable panels have been put together, no less for the Muslim roundtable, the Muslim conversation. I am really, really grateful for my colleagues in the room. We've had some great interactions in other spaces, and I'm really pleased that we're all able to come together in this symposium. My journey within the plant medicine world started back in 2018 when a friend encouraged me to take part in the Johns Hopkins study that Rabbi Zach mentioned earlier today. And that study, as many of you will know, was for religious professionals only, and over 20 of us took part. And I had two phenomenal experiences that changed my life. That will be no surprise to many of you who have engaged in similar kinds of journeys and had phenomenal, ineffable experiences. It changed my life to such a degree that actually now, some years later, I'm deeply embedded in the work that I'm doing within the realm of, or the intersection of Islam, Muslims, and psychedelics. So for a long time, after the study, I felt like I couldn't really talk about it to anybody for so many different reasons. It's such a big experience. We talk about integration and how important that is. I don't really understand what psychedelics were, let alone what integration ought to look like for somebody like me, somebody who comes from my background, somebody with my kinds of experiences. Integration is specific to each and every one of us, and it should be held as a sacred act that is unique to each person. And so for me, it took me a while to figure out that integration was really important. It's not something to be shortchanged in any way, shape, or form. And as time went on, not doing integration really came back to bite and pushed me to sort of go deeper into the integration side of my work, which ultimately led me to becoming more public about the journeys that I'd undertaken and the experiences that I'd had. And in January 2023, I decided to be very open about the work that I was doing, or at least my experiences and my belief about the intersection of these things, of the faith, the community, and the plant, and felt that we needed to be talking about this more openly, because surely there are many of us from the Muslim world all around the globe that have engaged in this kind of practice and are also looking for places, containers, where they can talk, discuss, integrate, build, dream, dare I say it. And so following these couple of conferences that I spoke at about Islam and psychedelics, a small digital community formed, and now over 18 months in, we've been meeting online every month. We have great conversations about where we're at in and of ourselves, of course, but also how the medicine continues to speak to us. We have a great sense of affinity and respect, despite most of us not having met each other in person ever, not knowing each other. And I think that's the medicine talking. I think that's the plant bringing us together in community, knowing that that is what we need at this season of our life. Building, and actually some of the people part of that community are in the room with you today. And so we're building this together. And my work really now is going to be more and more centered around building this community and building the sort of modern day access into the historical examples, saintly examples that we know of, when some of our greats in our tradition actually did partake in some kind of mind-altering substance. As was said in the earlier part of the day today, mind-altering experiences are not new in Islam. I think, Noah, you started us off this morning with that conversation, that whether it's dhikr, whether it's whirling, whether it's reciting the Quran alone, anything that sort of is kind of rhythmic or a practice, helps us to come to a place in ourselves that is outside of our normal day to day, and it helps to move forward spiritually, of course, but it also helps in other ways. And for me, plant medicines are no different. They might have a different pathway into them, but the actual ultimate goal is to be able to take ourselves on a spiritual, a mental health journey, a journey of love, affection, a journey to relieve ourselves of trauma, and all the things that we've heard about today. So I just want to share with you one little example of a saint who I deeply admire, and a little story that I just want to read straight to you rather than translating it. On a hot day, while he was watering his plants between the months of Shaban and Dhul Hijj in the year 1150 AD, a mystic, Ibrahim Ganduzi, suddenly arrived. Khwaja Moinuddin Chisti, rahimullah, offered to him extreme courtesy and a warm welcome and gave him a bunch of grapes. The mystic was very glad and satisfied by the hospitality and the respect. The mystic wanted to repay Khwaja Moinuddin Chisti. He took out a little portion of the oil cake and, upon chewing a bite of it, asked Moinuddin Chisti to eat the rest of it. As soon as he had taken a bite, he went into a strange transformation. He felt repulsiveness for everyday matters and looked to seek after the higher temperance and search out reality. Now, the story goes on, but it doesn't go on into his actual transformative experience. It goes on to his sort of the context of his life at that time, the fact that his dad had just died and they were experiencing invasions and so on and so forth in his country. But this is just one tiny example of the incredible history that Islam has around mind-altering substances and how that history needs to be brought into the present in a contextualized way to help people in our communities understand that not only are you doing this work, but the work itself is a sacred act, it's an act of worship, and that kind of narrative, that conversation needs to be developed a lot more, and that's going to be my work in the future.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again, Sughra, for the sharing. My name is Ismail Lourido Ali, and I'll be moderating a bit of this conversation today. I'll give a little bit of an introduction and then let our amazing panelists have presentations prepared that will take us through a bit of a journey on a few different perspectives. I want to start by saying that I got here a little bit later, I took a red eye, and I got to check out just that last panel. And I'm feeling really emotional in the best possible way because there were so many things that were said that I feel like are true for me, and I think maybe true for other people here. I also feel a little bit like Victoria stole my thunder because the whole frame around like, is this practice coming from internal? Are we reclaiming some thread? Or is it coming from external? Are we engaging with a contemporary transition of a modality or something like that? And is that really an or? I think is one of the core questions I actually at least sit with in this conversation. Maybe it's both, maybe it's all three and something else that we don't even know yet. So I think thinking about the directionality seems to be a really important theme in this conversation. I'm really grateful that it's already come up because what is spirituality? What are these traditions, if not something that we're bringing importance to in our own lives with each other, as was said so beautifully on that last panel. A tiny bit of background on myself. I've been using and utilizing psychedelics for more than half my life. I was born and raised on the West Coast. Actually, one more poll. There's been some statements made about the West Coast. How many people here came from the West Coast to be here? Yeah, see, we're well represented. Just want to say. I started working with psychedelics as a young person, first at the edges of the underground and later in the mestizo and indigenous practices that my family has been engaging with for multiple generations on both Colombian and other South American sides. And it was only more recently that this conversation about could there be a thread through my other lineage, my Islamic Pakistani lineage, could there also be something there? And the fact that this conversation is happening, the fact that we're all here today, feels like a big deal for little Izzy, that's for sure. So I'm really grateful to be here, and I imagine that there's something similar for a lot of you. I want to give also Madison a shout out because I think a lot of the things that she said earlier were really resonant for me at least. When I told my dad that ayahuasca taught me how to pray after years and years of him trying to get me to do the 5 daily prayers and understand what it meant, and like learn the words, I think something clicked, and maybe it's the thing that clicked for a lot of people here, which is that when you boil some plants and drink them, like maybe it's ginger, maybe it's Syrian rue, maybe it's chacruna, that something might happen and that might be part of this longer term relationality that we have with the natural world. And just recognizing that we talk about sacrament, we talk about religion, and tomorrow I'll be speaking a little bit about some of the legal issues. But really, I think so much of the theme here is our relationship to ourselves, each other, and the natural world and how that shows up. So just really appreciating that core theme. Finally, I want to say just for a roadmap for today, what we'll have is a bit of story, research, jurisprudence analysis. I probably don't need to say this to you, but no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people of any religion represent fully any religion. I think it was great to see the difference of perspectives just on this last panel that we saw. a tradition I know within the Jewish practice as well. And I think that being able to bring in these various perspectives, these various angles is so critical to bringing the richness of this experience, because what is the psychedelic experience if not some sort of subjective esoteric practice that we're just engaging with and sharing to the extent that we can. So just want to really appreciate everyone for being here and for being in this conversation. And I have a few questions, but what I'll do is I'll leave those to the end. I think for today, I want to just uplift these amazing speakers in contributing to the collective understanding and the meaning making of the religious and the psychedelic experience as experienced by people of and from the Islamic faith and culture from all kinds of positionalities. And with that, I think we'll start with Karina Bashir on the end and work this way and go from there. Thank you all so much for being here.
Hello, fellow children of Abraham. Here we are today together at last, both surprisingly and unsurprisingly brought together by psychedelics. I never thought I would have the chance to share that joke, so thank you, very exciting. So today I am here to speak to you all about Muslim and Islamic representation in the psychedelic space, where it exists, where it is missing, and how we can create room for greater inclusion. You might be surprised to learn that Islam is actually deeply present in the psychedelic ecosystem, though Muslims themselves less so. Who here has heard the phrase, "the wound is where the light enters"? Great crowd. Or "stop acting so small, you are the universe in ecstatic motion." Thank you. Does anyone know what these quotes have in common? Yeah. Correct. Jalaluddin Rumi, a 13th century Islamic scholar, mystic, and poet. And also, side note, I'm part of Toastmasters, and I did that whole quote then, and it was just silence. Nobody knew. I was like, okay, wrong crowd. Guys, get Pinterest. Rumi's influence is vast, and Sufism, Islamic mysticism, is embraced in many psychedelic and spiritual communities. Yet many do not realize that Sufism is inherently Islamic. As a Muslim who loves my faith, and I am very deeply honored to be here, thank you for this invitation. At first, I was moved to see the appreciation of Sufism in psychedelic spaces, but over time, I found myself feeling a quiet discomfort. I realized that while people celebrated the wisdom of Sufism and mysticism, they did not associate it with Islam. I witnessed how other traditions were honored with their lineages intact, while Sufism seemed to float in the sky, rootless, without origin. This may seem inconsequential, but it is part of a broader historical pattern. When we say aho in ceremony, we recognize its cultural origins. Yet when we quote Rumi, we rarely acknowledge his Islamic roots. And I invite you all to reflect on why that is. During colonial times, Victorian Orientalists could not reconcile their perceptions of Muslims as uncivilized desert people with the brilliance of scholars and mystics like Hafiz and Rumi. And that legacy persisted, and we can see it reflected in the West with the continued reimagining of Sufi mysticism as exclusively secular and exclusively universalist mysticism, detached from Islam. I do not believe that this erasure is intentional in psychedelic spaces, but it speaks to a larger issue, the one-dimensional representation of Muslims. We are all here on this panel because we want to bring healing to our communities, just like the panels that came before us today, and I'm sure everybody in this room. And one major barrier to Muslim communities having access to psychedelic medicines is the lack of Islamic scholarship on the permissibility of psychedelics. And to create that pathway, we need Islamic scholars and jurists to be interrogating questions around psychedelics, to be investigating and exploring. But for that to be possible, we need more Muslims present in this space to be bringing those questions, to be exploring, to be seeking to understand and expressing those desires to their imams, to their communities. And partly the lack of scholarship is due to the exposure issue in that, right? One, they have historically not been asked these questions. These plants largely do not grow in Muslim countries. So I was recently talking to a friend actually, and he was telling me about the use of ghat in Yemen, and that there's a lot of Islamic scholarship around that because it's so commonly used in Muslim countries, but with these other substances and medicines, there isn't. So we need to create an environment and an ecosystem where Muslims are bringing those questions to the ears of our scholars. And that means creating one in which Muslims see themselves represented in this space and reflected in this space. Consider this. Coffee was once met with skepticism in the Muslim world due to its mind-altering effects. In fact, it was banned by a 15th century Ottoman ruler. But luckily, Sufi mystics had already started embracing coffee as part of their spiritual practice, using its mind-altering effects to stay awake deep into the night for their meditation, for their prayers, and communing with the divine. Ultimately, through dialogue, scholarly debate, and engagement, coffee gradually gained acceptance for its spiritual benefits, for its mind-altering effects. Writings such as the pillars of tasawwuf, self-purification in response to the coffee question, helped solidify its place in Islamic culture. Eventually, coffee became an integral part of Islamic society and continues to be today. Psychedelics require the same type of engagement, and without it, our communities risk being excluded from critical conversations around healing and spirituality. And from a legal perspective, which you will hear a lot more about tomorrow by Izzy and Victoria and others, if we ever seek religious exemptions for psychedelic use under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, also known as RFRA, we would need to demonstrate sincere religious use. And that would be a lot more helpful if we had this kind of visible representation in our communities and scholars to validate the use within an Islamic framework. And the inclusion of Muslim voices in the development of care models for psychedelics is critical. Many in our communities suffer from trauma, from being refugees, from being immigrants, and from being marginalized minorities in this society. We, together with other diverse communities, must be considered in shaping clinical trials, in the nuances of set and setting, and in creation of programs designed to identify communities in need of care. And as Muslims, we do not come empty-handed to this conversation. As the rich traditions present here today, we too come bearing spiritual gifts to share with this community. And honoring the Islamic lineage of Sufism and creating space for Muslim representation opens up a well of wisdom that all of this community has the opportunity to draw from. That goes beyond the Pinterest quotes that are misattributed ones that were mentioned earlier, hashtag Coleman Barks, but we bring zikr, the practice of remembrance, the repetition of the names of God in meditation, in breathwork and silence. We bring fana, ego dissolution, self-annihilation in union with the divine. We bring al-ghaib, a framework for understanding the unseen, the layers of existence beyond the physical world. And today, 1.9 billion Muslims are fasting together in community for Ramadan, in which we limit our food, our water, and carefully monitor our actions in devotion to Allah. And as part of that, even a single word of gossip or anger can break our fast. It is a sacred journey of purification in which hunger nourishes our souls, and with each active remembrance, we feel the thinning of the veil between ourselves and the divine, all quite psychedelic concepts in their own right. These are only a few of the many jewels woven into the rich tapestry of Islam. And with that, I leave you all here and you all watching from the interwebs with two requests. First, to receive is an act of vulnerability, and I ask you to trust us in the offering of our wisdom, of our traditions, and our perspective to this space. And second, representation cannot happen in isolation. We need your help. When you speak of water fasting and vision quests, mention Ramadan. When organizing conferences and panels like this one, invite Muslim voices to the table. When enjoying the sweet pomegranates of Sufism and mystics like Hafiz and Rumi, acknowledge the roots from which they grow. And in making this space, allow Muslims to come as we are, to bring our values, our lineage, and our multi-dimensional selves. Though the storms of division may rage around us, and honestly do right now, here together we have the opportunity to build an alternative paradigm, a world in which we have the chance, who knows how long, to truly explore our religions, to explore our healing and our collective humanity, leaving behind the trauma and reactivity that has so long plagued our communities, without erasure and with profound mutual respect. May we borrow from each other, learn from one another, and together grow in our healing and spiritual community. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you.
My name is Fayzan. I am a fourth-year medical student for about 2 more months right before I graduate. Thank you. I'm a psychedelic researcher with Emory, the Emory Center for Psychedelics. And I am Muslim, but as it's kind of been talked about a little bit today, that's a really heterogeneous term. And so I get to play the role of researcher here, right? Like, what is this group of people who we collectively refer to as Muslims, how are they engaging with this phenomena, this ecological phenomena of psychedelics that are emerging, at least here in the West? So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to keep it really tight. Ismail has asked me to keep it, keep it really tight so we can focus on some questions. So I'll go through this, but my hope in this talk is that if you're not Muslim and you're like, what is the relevance of this talk to me, is that you'll see that the frameworks and the way that we're studying this population may be super relevant for how we study across monotheistic faiths. And some of the early insights may be some of the trailways that we can look at as how do we actually deepen the conversation of religion and faith more broadly with healing. So I'm going to talk about what is going on with US Muslims right now, why psychedelics and Muslims, and then what are the research projects we're doing at Emory that are really diving into those questions. So what's unique about US Muslims? One, it's a rapidly growing group of people. They're going to be the 2nd largest minority by 2050, religious minority in the United States. And it's really ethnically diverse, right? It's like compared to every other religion, a major religion in the United States, the composition of people who are a part of it is ethnically and from different sects, very heterogeneous and very different. And there's some unique aspects, right? Post 9/11, there have been unintended effects, and some have even speculated a segmentation of Muslim populations away from the general public. And that's led to things like stigma, inability to actually find therapists who understand these unique dynamics. And unfortunately, this came out in JAMA, which is one of the top medical journals, that US Muslims have twice the rate of attempted suicide as compared to the next religious group, and that's including atheist agnostics. So there's a high mental health burden that exists in this community. It's very little talked about. I know that from growing up in a Pakistani community in Atlanta, and yet we're seeing kind of the downstream effects of that not really being addressed or talked about. We also know from some kind of surveys of Muslim populations that generally, and once again, this is not a one-size-fits-all, Muslims generally do want things that fit within an Islamic jurisprudence. They want to know that this actually is things that could align or at least not be in tension with the things that they grew up with. They tend to look at things as a holistic view, like that the spiritual and the somatic and the mental are one conversation, and that those are not 3 separate conversations. And paradoxically, they have a lot of trust in Western institutions when it comes to healing practices. So that brings us to this question, like, why psychedelics and Muslims? Early studies, and this is kind of giving some general emphasis, early clinical trials that were happening were heavily female and heavily white. And as I was starting to look in some of the academic research as to what was going on, what was causing those recruitment gaps, I went to the Psychedelic Science Conference in 2023 and got to see people like Hena and Kamal and Sughra get up on stage and talk about this conversation of being Muslim and having psychedelic experiences. And yet I noticed something, which is that there was no infrastructure built out for this community. that these were conversations that were happening in isolation, so individuals, but there was no systematic research or rigor that was being taken place. So I went back to Emory. Part of what we get to do in the 4th year of medical school is do 6 months of research on a topic. And my research advisors, Roman Politsky, who's over there, and Ali Zarabi, were like, this is a great topic, go after it, go study what's going on in Muslim populations. Around that same time, a paper came out that Jay mentioned about the spiritual, existential, religious, and theological conceptions around psychedelic experience. It should be no surprise to anyone who's attending this that basically what correlates with the healing experiences is the amount of these cert experiences that occur for individuals. And that if we look at Muslims and psychedelics, with their already predisposition to spirituality and Islamic jurisprudence, the cert framework actually is quite compatible. And psychedelics arguably could be a way to actually speak into that group of people. So let's talk about what our studies are actually looking at for a moment. And this is really something I hope can be a framework for all the monotheistic religions. This is the Emory Muslim Psychedelic Group. It's a team of 7 of us and our sponsors as well. One of them's in the crowd today. Hi, Anusha. Thanks for coming from Atlanta. And we get together, and every week we look at transcripts, we look at data, and we actually are examining what is going on in the U.S. Muslim population when it comes to psychedelic use. So we have 3 arms. One is we wanted to see, do Muslims actually take psychedelics? And what are their general perceptions and attitudes, even if you don't? So that was our first study, which I'll talk about. The second one, which we just completed data collection, is, hey, for the Muslims who've had psychedelic experiences, what was the qualitative texture of your experience? Are there themes that are unique to Muslims, to monotheistic religions? Or does the classic universal conception of mysticism, does that hold true in this population? And the last one, we haven't kicked this off, is about clergy. How do we talk to imams and clergy and religious professionals in the Islamic faith and ask them these questions like Karina teed up, like, is it blasphemous? How do you respond to someone who takes Prozac and has a mind-altering effect of Prozac over a long period of time with an acute experience on ayahuasca? How do you juxtapose those two things? And so we haven't started that one, but that would be kind of the thesis of that third study. I want to talk about study number 1 really quickly. So we recruited 235 Muslims. Half of them were in person, and that's a key point here. We went to mosques in Atlanta, Georgia, and to Muslim Students Associations, and we surveyed them with paper surveys of what were your experiences and your perception and attitudes. The other half, we pushed out a survey with maps around psychedelic use and surveyed Muslims in that community. It was a highly educated, primarily female, predominantly millennial sample. And this one really blows my mind that from the online sample, more than around 50% of the people who responded to that talked about a first degree use. So for those of you who don't know that term, we borrowed it from Berkeley. First degree means that either you yourself or someone as close to you as a family member has had a psychedelic experience. So as a researcher, I'm not going to deny there's a huge selection bias with who chose to do the survey, but just looking at the number alone, that's a lot of Muslims who are actually using psychedelics, right? Like that's a phenomenon that we cannot ignore that's happening ecologically on its own. We used 2 validated survey instruments, the Muslim Perceptions Attitude Mental Health Survey, and then the Attitudes and Psychedelics Questionnaire. And I'm not going to get into the specific data, but the main thing here I want to emphasize is that we plotted these Likert scale values, and Muslims did not dramatically differ from the general population when it came to their perceptions attitudes. That was a surprising finding, and it held in the community recruitment versus the online recruitment that Muslims were open to learning about more. Muslims were interested in taking this stuff in the right settings. Legalization was something they were curious about if it was done in the right way. And we didn't expect that. When we went into that, we thought this would be a much more kind of separate and insulated community. Things like the Michael Pollan effect we're noticing are taking place in the Muslim community. I'll skip this for now, and let me go quickly on to study number 2. Study number 2 asked this question: how are psychedelic experiences understood, felt, and integrated? And classically, there's this debate of whether the mystical experiences that we study in clinical trials, does that look different in different groups of people? Do different religions and different cultures look differently there? And to kind of really to talk about some of the themes we're noticing that there was a lot of tension with Islamic jurisprudence. I love this quote, which is like, Islamically, I know where this falls. It's probably not okay. When I drank before, I felt like I was losing control, like I was escaping something. But with psychedelics, I feel like I'm being pulled deeper into myself, into truth, and I struggle with that. There's a theme of it being used for mental health purposes. For example, this participant said, I struggle with my disassociation. I was looking for something deeper that could help with me explore what's going on. Psychedelics helped me actually do that. And the last one, and I think this is going to be talked about by some of our fellow panelists, but our reinvention of how they looked at Islam. This participant says, I feel like I learned what Islam was from my culture and religion, and none of it was really true to the essence of Islam. And what I learned through psychedelics was spiritual teachings, and it's like spiritual teachings and peace is what aligns with the true essence of Islam. Like, I cannot begin to tell y'all that as a researcher bearing witness to other people's experiences, I'm having a phenomenological experience of their phenomena, right? Like, thank you. That this is as much a calling for me, and we were talking about this over at the hotel last night, that really that there is systemic possibility arising, that a calling that I'm feeling individually is actually answering and being a part of a broader collective calling in this group of people. So to wrap it off, I'll skip this for now. We're going to have an additional conference at Emory, April 2nd, April 3rd, and we'd love to hear if this is a topic that resonates with you, reach out, and it's a rich thing that's occurring right now. Thank you.
Fayzan, will you go back to the quote that you just skipped? Just this last one. Can you?
This one?
No, this next one. Go ahead and take a second on this one, because I think it's worth flagging.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Ibn Arabi is a saint in the Islamic tradition. Not all groups of Islam identify with him or believe in him, but I love this, right? I'm looking at like what is happening across generations, across cultures. And he says, death does not exist in reality, neither for the universe nor for the human being. It is simply a change from one state to another. The second quote is from a cancer patient from a clinical trial. Her name's de-identified. And just see what she says for a moment. I've died and I'm below the ground in this gorgeous forest, deep woods, loamy and brown. I'm seeing the trees growing and I'm part of them. It didn't feel sad or happy, just natural, contented, peaceful. I wasn't gone, I was part of the earth. I chose to include this here because across, like this is a Muslim religious saint, right? But they're talking about the exact same phenomena. I don't think Ibn Arabi was taking psilocybin like this cancer patient was, but are they speaking into a mystical and altered states of consciousness experience that transcends time and transcends generations, honestly, and that this cancer patient and this saint are pointing to the same phenomena? To me, it's actually a matter of, are we willing to believe and get invested into that possibility that maybe they're talking about the same thing? We can learn from these traditions, we can learn from these saints, and really enrich our current psychedelic practices that are here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Fayzan.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and Ramadan Mubarak for those who are observing it. I was feeling really nervous to speak today, but I'm feeling like my heart kind of softened because we're all being really vulnerable with each other and sharing a really big part of our lives, which is religion. So I'm just gonna dive in because I know we're like time crunch. So psychedelics are often talked about as tools for universal healing, meant to open the mind, expand consciousness, and connect people to something greater than themselves. But to me, universal doesn't always mean accessible. Psychedelic-assisted therapy, as it stands today, is largely built on Western, secular, and individualistic models. And don't get me wrong, that works for some people. But for billions of people whose worldviews are shaped by faith, community, and religious tradition, it often doesn't. Christianity, Islam, Judaism alone make up over half of the world. If we are not creating religiously attuned psychedelic care, we are failing a majority of the global population. We are talking about a movement that aims to transform mental health care, healing, and spirituality. But if it doesn't reflect the lived realities of religious communities, then it is incomplete. Today, I'll be focusing on Islam, clearly, but the need for religious attuned care is not unique to Muslims. Many religious practitioners, regardless of the faith, find that existing psychedelic frameworks often fail to reflect their spiritual worldviews. Without culturally and theologically informed approaches, these experiences risk being misinterpreted or stripped of their deeper meaning. And here's the reality. Religious people are already engaging with psychedelics. I mean, come on. They are already asking what it means to integrate them into their faith, or they're too afraid to ask. A little backstory for me, when I was in college and I was in the Muslim Student Association and I became public about my psychedelic use, I was completely shunned from the community. I lost all my Muslim friends. And I know that's a reality for many other Muslims living in America, and that's why I think it took so long for us to come out and kind of share our perspectives, but I'm really glad that we're here. Thank you. So instead of finding guidance, Muslims are often met with silence, dismissal, or frameworks that do not speak to them. This isn't just a gap in care, it's a failure to recognize how deeply faith shapes the way people experience and interpret altered states of consciousness. So what happens when religious frameworks are left out? When psychedelic-assisted therapy is designed without religion in mind, the result isn't just discomfort. It's misalignment at the most fundamental level. Take the way that we study these experiences, for example. Psychedelic research depends on tools that categorize and quantify mystical states. A common tool that many of you know probably is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. If you don't, the MEQ is a standardized tool used in psychedelic studies to measure the intensity of a mystical experience. It asks participants to rate statements related to unity and ineffability. But here's the issue. The MEQ assumes that all mystical experiences lead to the same place, which is oneness. For some, this resonates, and that's totally fine. But for many religious people, in this case particularly Muslims, mystical experiences are not necessarily about dissolving into unity. In Islam, an altered state might not feel like becoming one with the universe, but it might feel like standing before God. It might feel like a moment of awakening, a call to self-examination, or a reminder of moral responsibility. And the MEQ is just one example. Integration practices are often built around meditation and mindfulness, but for a Muslim, prayer, dhikr, fasting, even tarawih, may be a more powerful alternative. Psychedelic-assisted therapy is often focused on personal meaning-making, but for religious people, healing is not just about the self. It's about duty to God, family, and your community. When these frameworks aren't considered, it creates barriers to access. Not because religious people aren't interested in psychedelics, I mean, they are, but because they aren't being met where they are currently. So if we're going to expand psychedelic therapy to be truly inclusive, we need models that already exist in religious traditions. And in Islam, one of the most powerful frameworks for understanding transformation and self-awareness is nafs, which is also known as the self. In Western psychedelic discourse, ego death is often seen as the pinnacle of transformation. But in Islam, the self is not something to be destroyed. It's something to be understood, refined, and brought closer to God. Islamic scholars describe 3 major stages of nafs, and when we look closely, they actually map onto the stages of a psychedelic experience. The first one is nafs al-amara, the commanding self. This is the ego-driven self, ruled by desires, impulses, and worldly attachments. In psychedelic assisted therapy, this is the phase where people confront their shadows, unresolved fears, suppressed emotions, and unhealthy attachments. It can be very overwhelming. The second one is nafs al-lawama, the self-accusing soul. This is the stage of self-awareness and moral reflection. Here, a person starts to question their past, feel guilt, and maybe strive for self-improvement. And the third one is nafs al-mutma'inna, the soul at peace. This is the highest and most refined state of nafs. The self is no longer in conflict. It has surrendered to God and reached a place of inner peace. So why does this matter? This isn't just a concept, it's a framework, a structured way of understanding transformation that already exists in Islamic tradition. We don't have to invent something new. We already have the tools, we just need to apply them. And it's not just for Islam, it's for Judaism and Christianity. They all have their own frameworks for self-transformation and healing. For many Muslims, the concern isn't whether psychedelics are effective. I mean, we all know that they are, but it's whether they fit within an Islamic understanding of healing. And that's an important question. Because in Islam, healing isn't just about relieving symptoms. It's about restoring balance in the body, mind, and the soul. The Quran acknowledges the reality of anxiety, depression, and emotional distress, which means it inherently recognizes mental health as a real and valid struggle. Even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, spoke openly about grief, stress, and the importance of emotional well-being. And historically, Islamic healers never separated mental health from physical health. During the Islamic Golden Age, Islam was at the center of the global advancements in medicine, psychology, and philosophy. Scholars not only preserved ancient medical knowledge, but expanded upon it, developing some of the earliest holistic approaches to mental health. Avicenna, in the canon of medicine, described mental illness as a medical condition rather than a spiritual failing, which is, according to what Fayzan's research was saying, is something that many Muslims experience. Al-Razi was one of the first physicians to differentiate between types of mental illnesses and emphasize the role of emotional well-being in overall health. He used music therapy, aromatherapy, and structured social activities to help patients recover. Islamic medicine has never taken a one-size-fits-all approach to healing. If we look back at history, we see a long tradition of holistic medical care where spiritual and physical treatments were seen as interconnected. That tradition didn't just disappear, but over time, as colonial medical models replaced traditional Islamic healing, Muslims became more hesitant to explore alternative treatments. So where does that leave us today? Again, based on what Fayzan has presented us, many Muslim communities still struggle with mental health stigma, treating it as a moral failing rather than a real connection. And this is where the contradiction really appears, because Islam actually encourages healing. The issue is not just whether psychedelics can help, it is the frameworks for healing being offered that do not often speak to religious communities in the way that honor their faith. The reality is, Islam has always embraced medical advancements when they are used ethically, thoughtfully, and with the right intention. If Islamic medicine has always been adaptable, then why are we so hesitant to explore new possibilities within traditions that already exist? Because at its core, this is not just about psychedelics. It's about the assumptions that we make about who gets to heal and how healing is supposed to happen. So if we claim psychedelics help people see more clearly, think more deeply, and connect fully to their humanity, then why haven't we applied the same depth of understanding to how different faiths experience them? That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kamal.
Greetings, everyone. I don't want to repeat what they have said, but I will bring it into a different angle. I'm stepping into this discussion. I know Izzy when he was a kid, when he was in grade school, probably 5 or 6. I can tell you stories about him. Stepping into this field informed by my research on the intersection between ethics and law. I did my doctorate on the end-of-life experience of the Prophet Muhammad, the last 3 months of his life, from an ethics and law as a chaplain who is specialized in end-of-life. So when I come to this, I widen the discussion by being a practical theologian. In my experience with Muslims at the end of life, when the question posed about, shall we disconnect from life support? All indications say yes, but Muslims are afraid because the first filter they think about is the filter of law. They're afraid to make the wrong decisions. So simply say, let's pray for a miracle. In other words, let somebody else make the decision. So we keep that in our understanding as we dive into psychedelics, but also Sharia is contrary to popular belief. It's about ease. It's about making it easy for people to practice, not make it difficult for people to practice. There are special rules within jurisprudence, the jurisprudence of the minorities, fiqh al-aqalliyat. And today we deal with another form of jurisprudence, fiqh al-waqi', the jurisprudence of the moment, of what falls in front of you. So that means it's not just the law, literal law. We need to look at beyond the literal interpretation. So there is the Islamic legal maxim of easement that says whenever things become narrow, you need to widen it. That fits well within practical theology. What I studied is whenever a matter becomes narrow, that's it, we need to widen to bring other disciplines. Keep in mind, in Islamic tradition, ethics is not a separate field from the law. you get to the law, you get to ethics through the law. But also the purpose of the law is ethics. So a law that is void of ethics is not part of the divine understanding for us. So the traditional approach that Muslims should not take any mind-altering substance is part of the 5 goals of jurisprudence. But the question is, does the use of psychedelics also, that understanding, apply to it? Well, it depends on who you ask. So it's not a clear-cut case. I heard a scholar recently say, no, without mentioning names, a Northeastern scholar saying probably we will not issue an edict against psychedelics and will be treated more like medical marijuana. So that's an important development. So this focus on the Muslim community is welcomed. So I thank you for hosting us here at Harvard Law School. Recently, there was also a story on NPR, All Things Considered, which I was part of it as well. This national, international platform sheds light on Muslims at the time that they need it in that part. As they mentioned, we cannot deal with it individually or alone. So already there is a shared bond between Muslims who use psychedelics and people of other communities. So the bond is already existing. Also, what we need to do is step into that bond. And also we need to remember the ethics of care. So it's beyond just the law. We look at the experiences, the client-provider relationship, and it's no longer a monopoly of faith leaders to give the opinion. So there are other people who give an opinion, including medical practitioners, since we're going to include the harm reduction. So here we widen, but often used to be or arbitrary focus on recreational use, which is, by the way, it's a very convenient way of moving away from answering the question, or indulging into the real issue. And by this, by focusing on recreational use, we move away from vulnerabilities of communities, including PTSD, including suicidal ideation, including mental illness. The most important part here is what we see as manifestation in all of that, and in some of the stories today, is the disconnection from God. That's one of the most dangerous things that we look at as this vulnerable segment of the community driven by their disconnection from God, find other ways of connecting. They're already unmasked. Have you heard of this term? Not belonging to a mosque community. They're being kicked out somehow, or they don't find the space, or there is no welcome, or the looks that no one wants to have. So there is already one. But ultimately, that moves the people, the individual, away from God. And that is one of the top priorities of Islamic jurisprudence, preservation of the religion, including your relationship with God. There are 5 goals. We don't talk about them. We talk about the 5 pillars of practice. That's what you know about Islam. But when you dig deeper into Sharia, you look at the preservation of religion as the utmost priority of Islamic law and Sharia. The second, preservation of life. So we don't prolong life, we preserve religion first. And third, preservation of the mind. So that's what is talked about when it comes to psychedelics. Then preservation of resources or wealth, preservation of lineage or manners. So the focus on the preservation of the mind, number 3 of the priorities, and ignoring the top utmost, the preservation of religion, and then life when it comes to people who have thought about suicide. I think we need to not leave any rock unturned and discuss it. And this is a call for all scholars to come together. The third one is also the diversity of the Muslim community. When I did my research, most books about Islam treating the individual as fully practicing without any issues to deal with. Raise your hand if you don't have any issues. I don't see anyone. Okay. The idea is we ignore the secular, the one who's struggling with relationship inward and outward, the abused, many of the converts, many who are immigrants who came from war-torn countries, many who are indigenous African-American Muslims who are still dealing with racism. All of that is ignored, so we need to pay attention to that. Also, the marginalization of the community by isolating and othering. So I think the call needs to be for more compassionate approach to people who are experimenting with psychedelics, people with mental illness, and the dismissal of their pain is really painful on us to watch and more on them. So that basically reinforces, encourages, and fosters the environment to facilitate connection between the individual and God. Where people go to for that? They go to the Islamic Center, the question about within the religion, but there are barriers that we need to address. More of our respected imams are not trained to care for the specific needs of this specific community. The first requirement for hiring an imam, which used to be all imported from outside the US, is to be a memorizer of the Quran, which is a great quality. How does that relate to taking care of needs of refugees? It's irrelevant, despite its religious importance. So the second one is an issue of budgeting, issue of training. So we need to have multi-approach. That's why we cannot do it Muslims as alone. And also, let's not forget that the driving force behind people who are turning into psychedelics is to have a transcendent, an experience with a transcendence. They're searching for love, void of what we offer to each other. So this is a call for us. If the call in the Quran and in the Hadith actually is the believers are without faith, without love among the believers, you cannot attain faith. And we are stand together like the teeth of the comb. That means equal. Well, when you see someone in pain, we need to move beyond the law. Keep in mind that the law can be suspended in the existence of a necessity. And that's another legal maxim. So I'm not here to change Islam. I'm here to widen it to include trauma for a specific community and pain, disconnection from God, and more importantly, the relationships that we all have with people who are yearning for a relationship with God, wants to stay within the fold of faith, yet unable or overwhelmed with their experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for all of your work and for following me along for almost 30 years. We only have a couple minutes, so I have a couple questions I'm gonna pose to our speakers, and I think I'm gonna pose two questions, one that's a little bit more fun and spicy, and one that's a little bit more chill. So you can decide which one to answer to, and we'll go in the same order maybe. And then I think if we can get Sughra as a last word, that would be great. And we've spoken to this a little bit, but the first thing I want to say is huge shout out. There's a lot of rabbis in here. And I think that is so awesome and very impressive. And my first more like neutral, spacious question is like, what would it take for Islamic leadership to show up in a different way than they have so far? And do they need to? And I think, Kamal, you speak to this a little bit with like, whose authority is it to speak about what? So I think that's one thing around like, what does it take to bring more of a funnel into that? And then the other question, if you don't want to answer that one, is there's this concept that came up a little bit that I heard it also come up in some of the conversation around the Jewish jurisprudence and so on, around this idea of intoxication, the veiling and the unveiling. There's a lot of themes here that go on in that direction. So I'm curious if you want to offer a word on this concept of like, what is the difference between intoxication and creating a veil versus intoxication or detoxification, maybe in removing the veil? Two very different questions, but we've got a diverse audience. So if you guys could just spend like literally like a minute each, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, we don't have much time, really. The idea is when something hits home, people react. Many of you are parents. When your children are sick, you change your life, you leave your work, you do everything. And we've seen that in many communities without venturing into another movement. When someone in the home is using or doing things that you did not raise them to do that, many of them, some we kicked them out, but some took them in with love. So many already are dealing with that, but the shame and the taboo and the pride and arrogance sometimes stop between taking this issue seriously. But when it comes to preservation of religion, for a group, it makes no sense to see converts if your people already within the religion is moving away. So come in within and fix the house from within. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know which question to answer. I'm going to stick with the safe one because I'm not feeling spicy today. I'm sorry, could you repeat the first question?
Yeah, just like what it would take in your mind to bring more people into this conversation.
To bring more people in, I think this is an amazing start. Psychedelic science was an amazing start, and I think that kind of like taking inspiration from what the Jewish community is already doing, like Natalie and Madison and the Jewish Psychedelic Summit. I love their work, and I think that like we would really benefit from that as a whole. But I think it can be kind of tricky because we all have, I mean, same with like Judaism, there's different like more people are like more strict than others. And so we have to respect that. Like, when we're at a mosque, usually half the time women are separated from men. And so we have to make sure like we're accommodating some of those asks and needs. And I think that if like bringing it to like an imam or something, like to get more of them present at an event like this, sometimes I wonder if we need to like shape everything like a project and bring it to them and be like, okay, we have it for your review, like make a decision here, right? Because I feel like they might be kind of feeling nervous to make a decision about it when it isn't even like legal in most states.
So good thing this is being recorded on live stream day.
Hey, yeah, and I think that especially because, post 9/11, we are just so targeted all the time. Like imams are worried about like making us more of a minority in that sense. So yeah, that's what I'm saying about it.
Okay, we've got literally like 90 seconds for 3 people, so if you could give like a sentence each, that would be great, just to close this.
I don't know if it'll be a sentence. It'll be a quick anecdote, though. This makes me just giggle, honestly. I was at a 4-year-old's birthday party, and an uncle, like a uncle in his 50s, comes up to me. He's like, "Oh, you're studying Islam and psychedelics? I did shrooms the other day." And you could look at the face of trepidation on this guy's face, as if he was looking for reassurance from me that it was okay. Like, you're not breaking the law, you're gonna be okay, you're not going to hell. And I think the strange irony around the intoxication question is it's happening. I mean, the quantitative evidence is impressive, but how many anecdotes, how many stories do I have of just college students, uncles, aunties, like people being like, I want to do this, I have done this, am I going to hell? And that fear really needing to be dispelled by people like Kamal's, or people who actually are willing to show some genuine leadership in the space and say, hey, the intentionality of what you're bringing into this matters a lot more than, a yes/no question to whether you should do shrooms or not. Thank you. And we do that for coffee, we do that for Prozac, but for some reason when it comes to psychedelics, and maybe this is a remnant of the war on drugs, Muslims get so scared, and I see it in all age groups. And so I really hope there's a generational shift that starts to occur from things like this that happen at places like Harvard that legitimize and bring some like, this is a real conversation happening.
Thank you so much, Fayzan. 30 seconds, Karina, last word.
30 seconds. I'm going to take the spicy question. So in Islam, we believe that Allah is closer to us than your jugular vein. And that means that the veils that we talk about dropping, these are our perception of the veils. There's actually no distance between us and God, between all of you and God. So when we are here as Muslims, and we believe, as humans on earth, we are here to be stewards to creation, which means to take care of the humans here, to take care of society, to take care of the plants and animals and the earth. And I believe that when we live in alignment with that in our day-to-day actions and our greater purpose, those veils drop. And that it's a continued journey that we have with our lives as humans and with our souls. And it's supposed to be a journey. There's supposed to be tests. Faith means to have belief even when there's gaps of feeling it and when there are challenges. So I would just say that I think, psychedelics help people when we live in this chaotic society to maybe drop those veils in a kind of more acute experience so that they realize that's possible. But as we all know, psychedelics invite us to integrate, to take those lessons and put them into our lives and into society. And that means that we, ideally, what the messages we receive are how we as individuals, as souls walking today and in collective community can live as stewards of creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for letting us go a few minutes over. We're really, really grateful to be in this conversation. Thank you again for all of it.